Good morning, friends. As we consider the humility we ought to have before the Lord and as a result toward each other, let's consider the events recorded for us in John chapter 13. Because Jesus is with his disciples in the upper room, it's the night in which he's going to be betrayed, and indeed his betrayer is in that room with him. And yet what does Jesus do? Well, Jesus takes on himself the role of a servant, literally of a house servant, and he washes the disciples' feet. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the custom of that day, whenever a host invited guests to his home for a dinner or a banquet or what have you, he would provide a means for his guests to have their feet washed. The footwear of the day, of course, was sandals. So simply by walking from place to place, your feet would quickly get dirty, even if the rest of you was clean. So it was appropriate to wash your feet when entering someone else's home for such an occasion. But the host wouldn't just offer a basin of water for the guests to wash their own feet. He would provide a servant or someone to act in that role to wash the guests' feet for them. And that job would that job would generally go to the least servant, the person with the least status in that home, because it wasn't the most dignified thing to do, to having to wash other people's feet. Well, Jesus is in a sense hosting the Last Supper in the upper room, but of course there are no house servants on hand to wash anyone's feet. And we can see that none of the disciples had jumped to the task and volunteered to do it themselves. So at a certain point, Jesus gets up and takes the task upon himself. He took the role of the least servant and washed the disciples' feet. And once he was done, he asked the disciples, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you." And friends, if nothing else that we've talked about this week, if nothing else knocks the pride out of us, this ought to. Because Jesus confirms his exalted status. He confirms here that he is the Lord, that he is the master. And yet, even in recognition of that status, he acts as a servant toward his people, doing for them what would normally have been left for the least of the servants. And then he says, "What I have done for you, you must do for each other." Because even if we think about who is great and who is little in the kingdom of God, there is absolutely none greater than Jesus Christ himself. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He is our Lord and God. And yet he humbled himself. He humbled himself so completely to take on the role of a servant, not only here at the Last Supper and washing the disciples' feet, but from the very moment he entered the world, in simply subjecting himself to living in the flesh, living in a sinful and fallen world. He was serving the people he came to save. In all the temptation he endured, and doing that without falling himself, without sinning once, he served the people he came to save because he had to endure. He had to persevere. He had to conquer both Satan and sin itself in order to qualify as a perfect sacrifice, in order to take our sin on himself, as well as to then place his own righteousness on us. And obviously he went to that cross, not only enduring the pain inflicted upon him by sinful men, but he endured the perfect righteous wrath of God against the sin he bore on our behalf. He put himself in that position of unimaginable pain and horror for the sake of serving those he came to save by doing what it took to provide them salvation. And then we consider all of that, and then the foot washing he did as sort of a singular encapsulating event of his willingness to serve. And so we go back to that event for a moment, and we do remember that Judas Iscariot, the one who was to betray Jesus into the hands of sinful men, he was present at that time as well, and Jesus washed his feet too. So Jesus not only washed the feet of those ranked far below him in the kingdom, the disciples in general, he was willing to wash the feet of an outright enemy. How much, therefore, should we be willing to serve one another, regardless of whether we are greater or littler in God's kingdom? Regardless of how far along we are in the process of sanctification and spiritual maturity, Jesus has set the example for us. Let us therefore serve one another and love one another, all those who are in the kingdom, regardless of any other factors that in this world might cause divisions: social status, financial status, ethnicity, prior creed, culture, or background, how far advanced we are in the faith, in understanding, in wisdom, or whatever else. May nothing stand between us and loving one another, serving one another in humility with love. I pray, friend, that you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you Sunday.